Welcome back to our first plenary for this afternoon, and it's really a delight. Day 4 of the conference, and it looks like we're getting bigger now instead of smaller. So that's very unusual for a conference. It's a very good sign. Also, this is the slot that in the UK they usually call the graveyard slot, so where people are not really alive, but that also looks very different here. I think we have a very keen audience here, and we have a very interesting program for the next 45 minutes. We have 2 talks. First, we have a talk by Dr. Amal El-Obeidi, and I will introduce her briefly, and then we have a talk by our keynote speaker, Professor Dr. Susanne Baer. Dr. Amal El-Obeidi is currently researching at the University of Bayreuth. She studied and taught at the University of Benghazi, and she did her PhD in political science at Durham University in the UK. Among other functions, she was the Dean of the Faculty of Economics and Political Science at Benghazi University. And I think she's considered one of the leading intellectuals for civil society in Libya. She's worked as an expert for international organizations, such as, for example, the United Nations. In terms of research topics, she has worked, among other things, on things such as political elites, tribes and tribal politics in Libya, women's rights, and also particularly, of course, at the moment, incredibly important security and migration issues. So Dr. El-Obeidi, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Good afternoon, dear friends and colleagues. It's a great honor to be here and take part of this very important event and interesting and important event. I would like just to introduce myself as a scholar. I'm Associate Professor of Political Science at University of Benghazi. Currently, I'm based at the University of Bayreuth. My university, my original university, was founded as the Libyan University just after the independence in 1951. The university was established on 15th of December 1955 as the first Libyan university which started with the Faculty of Education as a core of the university and was followed by other faculties. By 2004, there were 10 universities in Libya. University of Benghazi was one of these universities that include 23 faculty. Sorry, it seems that, yeah. 23 faculty and 230 departments. And again, the university, since May 2014, the University of Benghazi main campus, which is located at Garyunis area, which is at the western gate of the city of Benghazi, was targeted by the extremists. And unfortunately, many of the buildings of this campus were destroyed, including the most important building, which is the library or the main library of the university and the historical archive. The academic year was interrupted and the university was not functioning for a year, almost a year. In September 2015, the university started functioning and continued the academic year in the alternative locations in safe areas such as schools. So we were sharing basically classes with primary schools. So the students, the primary schools start in the morning and we take over in the afternoon. We start after 2. All faculties and departments were distributed at schools and other buildings in safe areas. This was a general information about University of Benghazi. In this context, as a result of the war that took place in the city since 2014, I would consider the university as a model for institutions of higher education in areas of conflict, which faced many problems and challenges and difficulties, including the following points. First, the security. The security still faces significant the country actually still faces significant security challenges that have resulted deprioritization and delays of many reform efforts concerning the higher education. Second, institutional capacity. The Civil War directly affected institutional capacity of the higher education through vandalism of records and archives at various campuses. Third, the human capacity. War also and the uprising impacted Libyan higher education, human capacity, and the continuation of the war in many areas, in Benghazi and Derna city and some of the areas in the west and the southern Libya, led to shortage of teaching staff. Many have left the country and the cities, these cities for security reasons. Due to the vacuum of the political institutions in Libya regarding the higher education establishment now, the phenomena of the establishing of new universities that not subject to any technical or scientific criteria. These universities were founded only on tribal and regional basis. The state of political division in Libya, with two governments in the east and the west, has affected many aspects of life, including the higher education, where adherence to the simplest standards of quality, the preservation of the values of higher education are far being attained. The academic women, the same as well as all women in Libya, faced many challenges after 2011. They are victims of the war. They are also victims of a travel ban without male companion, muhram, or a security permit for those under the age of 45 that was issued just 2 years ago, unfortunately. All this prevented women from traveling and limited their international participation in conferences, workshops, or applying for scholarships. One of the most pressing challenges is uphold and promote the values of higher education, including academic freedom. Finally, I would like to share some of my recommendations for SAR future events. First, focusing on the gender aspect of the academic at risk. Women are facing severe challenges at all levels. This deserves special attention to this issue, or this particular issue. Assist the performance of the host institutions who are taking part in assessment to the performance of the host institutions who are taking part in hosting a scholar at risk. Focusing on higher education and conflict areas. I think this is another topic should be taken in consideration for different, as all the scholars are coming from conflicting areas, and the higher education was severely damaged and hit. I think this is a topic that should be considered in the future for more activities. Thank you so much for the invitation to be one of the speakers in this panel, and I look forward to cover any other questions may raise from the audience. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. El-Obeidi. I think you not only gave us some recommendations, but also you put our direction into sort of not just the repression of scholar, but also at the destruction of infrastructure and at sort of what war does to institutions, and that we should take that in mind as well. Now I have a great pleasure. I would like to ask Professor Catharine Stimpson to come forward to the stage. She is, just to say 2 sentences about her. I mean, after last night, probably no one, I don't really have to introduce her. She's a professor of English. She's an eminent feminist scholar. She's She's Dean Emerita of the Graduate School of Arts and Science at New York University, and last night we all found out she is also a force of nature. And she held so many positions that in her long career that I can't mention them. Tonight she's here in her function as chair of the Board of Scholars at Risk, and she's here to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Professor Susanne Baer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I don't know if I'm a hurricane as a force of nature, but I really appreciate being called that. Thank you. It is a great honor to introduce our next keynote speaker, Professor Dr. Susanne Baer. I must make a confession. I had known about her for years, not personally. This is the first time that I've had a chance to greet her personally. Her brother, Uli Baer, is my beloved colleague at New York University. He's a noted Rilke scholar. So he and I would gossip about university politics. We would talk about Rilke, and then he would talk about what he really wanted to talk about, his awesome sister. He would say, my awesome sister, my amazing sister, my beloved sister. And it was one of those cases where a brother's love was borne out by the sister's achievements. You all know her work, her honorable work in law, in gender studies, and in human rights. Germany is privileged to have her as on the Federal Constitutional Court. A notable global honor, in 2017, she was elected a fellow of the British Academy, and that's not an easy election to win. I now read her work, as well as listen to her brother. I read her work. I admire her immensely. I wish she would join her brother at New York University, but I have a feeling Germany will not let her go. So with great happiness, and we're all so privileged to welcome Dr. Professor Justice Susanne Baer.
Welcome, and thank you so much. He's a good man, my brother. We have little time, and I think for a speaker with the privilege to abuse your time, because you have to listen now, I try to make as much as possible out of it. So at this conference, you already heard keynotes on some of the key issues which we care about: academic freedom, open inquiry, social stability, and sustainable development. On this last day, I want to address the institutional side of it, the institution that hosts scholars, that allows for, that empowers and invests in research and teaching, that organizes education, the university. You may see it as the institutional answer to the question of what needs to be done. Many things need to be done. What I'm going to focus on is the institutional side. And since I consider the political situation we live in deeply worrying, I also call for a university ethics. So there's an appeal in this statement, and I even call it a Berlin call for university ethics. Why is that? Do you know Humboldt? Heard that name? There is a Berlin university that carries the name, biased as I am, and many others on many continents. There's a foundation. Yet the name refers to, as usual, people. Primarily, Humboldt is a reminder of Wilhelm, a Prussian bureaucrat who started what is now known as the Humboldt model of higher education in Berlin in 1810. It is based on the freedom to choose your course of studies, noteworthy, a freedom for the students. in a community of scholars and students and free from economic or political pressure and limitations yet funded by the state. Today, we call this academic freedom and institutional autonomy. However, in the family, Humboldt, and this relates to the brother thing, there's also Alexander, who's sometimes forgotten, the geographer, naturalist, and linguist, a foreseer of climate change, and the author of Cosmos, a wonderful work. He did not only live interdisciplinarity, yet also lived a cosmopolitan life. As a gay man, eventually countering even colonial mindsets of the day regarding the unknown, the other. And in addition, there's Caroline. Never forget the women. She married Wilhelm and yet, at the time, led a liberated life. Like Alexander, she did not only travel, but went places to stay and have an impact. She also led a literary salon, yet at the time the only legitimate format to stage debate, organize collective inquiry, contextualize knowledge. I think that in light of threats to academic freedom and to democracy overall, these three are somewhat inspiring. I think, and that's the point, you need all three of them, not only Wilhelm, not just Alexander, and not only Caroline, to understand what we are looking at when we look at a university and what we should fight for when we're fighting for academic freedom and university autonomy. Wilhelm, to understand the nature of academic freedom and more particularly the relationship between the university and democracy. Alexander, to get the cosmopolitan nature of the task, to implement what I will call glocalization in light of internationalization, and Caroline, to truly value the academy as a diverse space of exchange among equals. And why is this so important today? I think that universities are specifically important because democracy is under attack, as are human rights and the institutional arrangements of the rule of law to protect them. And pause for a moment. Democracy? What exactly is this? How is this to be defined? This keynote certainly does not allow me to go into all the details, but undeniably, the strategically well-planned attacks on democracy we face around the globe by populists, by war criminals, employing the more or less subtle means of autocratic legalism, as well as the outright destruction of democracy by means of sheer force, do exist, and they are deeply worrying. Certainly, locations and contexts differ tremendously, as does the harm. Also, this happens outside of and inside the academy. But typically, activists, journalists, judges are targeted, and many more. But first, these attempts also target scholars and students. Scholars and students are, and this is no coincidence, persecuted, threatened, jailed, even murdered, because this is part of an attack on democracy. In light of this, it is of crucial importance to understand that democracy does in fact rely on universities and on academic freedom in very specific ways. It is universities that have a specific role to play in allowing and defending democracy. And again, be sure to properly define democracy when you start talking about it, to know what is at stake. I think we need to invest in and protect academic freedom and in the institutional autonomy, not only because research is fascinating and the greatest thing ever, but it has a particular meaning and function for democracy. As part of it, we need to understand the university's global nature and the practical need of equality and diversity within. So let me first and primarily address this role of the university today for democracy. Second, let me comment very briefly on academic freedom and institutional autonomy, because I think there's also a misunderstanding regarding this, because both respond to responsibility. And there we'll move to the ethics. In a governance mode of modest realism, this ethics shapes or should define how and how far and with whom universities implement their international dimension as diplomatic universities when they go abroad. Yet this ethics also informs their being true hosts at home, willing and able to interact with the others, the guests, as equals, those coming in. This is why I think, third, that dealing with scholars at risk from the privileged position of Free University of Berlin or any other such institution is a litmus test for universities. If universities live up to their democratic function, but only if they do, they pass this test. And they do if they allow for, if they empower, and if they invest in different voices, yet also protect such diversity among equals. As a result, international cooperation must take political context into account. And scholars at risk must enjoy more than a gracious gesture from us. But they and their expertise must be truly welcome, and that's a demanding task. All of this may draw inspiration from the Humboldts or whoever you want to pick. It also, I think, suits Berlin because this is a place that went through dramatic political changes throughout history, and it is suitable to Berlin because you are here. So a Berlin call for university ethics. The starting point, again, is the inextricable link between the university and democracy. And again, democracy needs to be properly defined, and the university I talk about is also not just some other place of higher learning. The link between universities and democracy does only exist between a democracy that deserves its name and a university that lives up to the enlightened understanding of academic freedom and university autonomy. And this cannot at all be taken for granted anymore. Regarding democracy, beware not to be tricked, because there's an imminent and powerful abuse of the label, and it's going on around the globe. What, to name just one, Hungarian President Orbán has labeled illiberal democracy is not one. Nor is a democracy that relies on tweeted news and denies the existence or relevance of facts. Rather, these representatives of what they still call democracy abuse the very concept to destroy it. When politicians win majorities in elections proclaiming illiberal democracy and us winning against all other forces, when courts are ridiculed, when constitutions are changed into a contradiction in terms to undo the rule of law, not to protect it, and when truth and facts and arguments become indeed labels for lies, legends, or libel, echoed by powerful people in office or algorithms, we have a serious problem. But these regimes are also in need of, these illiberal regimes are also not in need of a university. In fact, academic freedom is disturbing their plan and a threat to their power. Indeed, a democracy that deserves the name is thus inextricably related also to fundamental human rights. It is necessarily liberal, equality, and dignity-based to refer to the grand consensus after 1945 and after 1989 and after so many reversals in history or huge changes. And it's not a Western concept either. Democracy safeguards these basics for each and every one via the rule of law and the separation of powers, and such a system of checked and balanced power does allow for, and in fact need, the university. This is not, some other place to think, research, etc. However, this does also only apply to a university that deserves the name. And also beware not to be tricked by false labels. Regarding academic freedom and the university, there's a very similar risk to the one that it is out to destroy democracy. There are institutions out there called academic that I think do not deserve the name. When a school offers biased or even oppressive training and indoctrination to selected peers instead of opportunities to think and explore and articulate opinions, it has, I think, nothing to do with the university properly defined. Yet other cases are less clear, way more complicated. When universities become sites of lies instead of truth, of hate instead of speech, of ideology instead of research and teaching, there are sites of at least battle or controversy, yet they are not engaged in what defines a university as such. This is because they lack the necessary practice of diversity among equals, which I consider, with Humboldt, Alexander, and Caroline, an integral part, an inherent part, a necessary part of the whole endeavor. Namely, and rather prominent in the UK, but also in the US and in many other countries, there are speakers that claim a right to academic freedom, a right to free speech in universities, in order to, a long list, call the Holocaust a lie, human race is a fact, inherently unequal, lecture on women as beings natural inferior to men via brain size, or categorize sexual minorities as sick freaks and aberrations of nature, or present the belief in God's creation as science and natural science as crap. And to avoid misunderstandings, you can say this, you can write it, you can use any means of communication as long as you don't hurt someone, and this is free speech, whether you like it or not. But if such hate or lies or ideology achieves to be defined as research and teaching, to enjoy academic freedom and institutional autonomy, we are on another plane. Then I think it is an abuse of the very idea of why we're all here for: research and teaching, scholars and student, the academy, the university. Lies, or often quoted alternative facts, or hate or ideology is not just another approach or topic or result of research. It is lies, hate, and ideology. It may and must be subject to debate, again to avoid misunderstandings, but it is not research and teaching. In addition, bullying and threats and insults of critical and independent scholars are neither. Instead, these are attempts to capture the space of academic freedom, to in fact destroy it. So we have much reason to talk about the destruction, the bombs, the murders, and the killing. What I want to also raise attention to is there are very subtle ways to undo what the university and democracy are about. Also note that these people and organizations act based on well-funded strategies. Also note that they are defended by many more, and that they attempt to enlist all liberals in that defense in the name of the right to free speech, to, however, denounce women and people of color and all the others, to ridicule, and eventually to defund and exclude critical work. In fact, such attempts, I think, seek to destroy the university rather than contribute to it. As free speech, all fine, and I would be the first to defend them. As university research, that's another issue. And this is all about Wilhelm von Humboldt. Because to understand what the university is about, or it should at least attempt to be about, the university is about an everlasting process of trying to develop, foster, invest in, empower research, an exchange in diversity among equals. Bildung was the term, Bildung, non-translatable, one of those, Bildung, a term that carries a meaning beyond its usual translation as higher education, because it is a specific type of it. It's a development of mind and soul, as Humboldt said it, towards civic virtues via academic encounter. And I could spend days on thinking about that. Encounter, mind and soul, etc., etc. And he saw this not only as economically profitable for a society to have good engineers, etc., and to add another Humboldt scholar, educator and civil rights leader, W.E.B. Du Bois, I can never say that properly, he stated, oh, thank you, he's a knowledgeable person in the audience, he stated in 1902 that the ideals of education must not be allowed to sink into sordid utilitarianism, but education must keep broad ideals before it and never forget that it is dealing with souls and not with dollars. Put this way, dealing with souls defines a university as a very specific and precious place. So Wilhelm promoted higher learning as an asset of a democratic society, not just an asset to profitable Fortschritt, but an asset of a democratic society. Academic freedom and freedom of research was freedom to study in the community of scholars and students in an institution that enjoys corporate autonomy despite being funded by the state, to allow for, to empower, and to invest in citizens. This is the link between democracy and the university, if both deserve the name. Based on this concept, as a lawyer, the United Nations phrase it now in similar terms. Higher education has a vital role in promoting democracy beyond the practical as a human right. The Council of Europe says that, I quote, challenges that Europe is facing today, including disenchantment with democracy, integration of refugees, and the rise of violent extremism, make education for democratic citizenship and human rights more important than ever. And I think we need to step up this work in the years to come. Indeed, the attacks themselves are a striking indicator of why. Wherever autocrats are out to destroy a democratic society, wherever autocrats are out to destroy a society that respects all present as equals and limits majority power by fundamental rights, eventually protected by courts, they do attack specific institutions and particular people, not just everyone. They're very strategic. And where do they start? The media, the courts, and scholars. Sure, those are the ones who could step in the way. Those are the disturbing factors. As such, what illustrates the nexus between the university and democracy is the relationship between the pressure and the threats on academics and critical thinking and the presence of non-democratic forces in society. The more democracy is at risk, the less academic freedom. Scholars who oppose autocratic regimes and ideologies do report that they were not targeted for being somewhere, wrong place, wrong time, but for being academics somewhere at that place in time where critical thought is not wanted. And often, thinking women in particular are not wanted. This has happened in Turkey. It also characterizes the attacks on universities in Hungary or Poland and in so many other places, spiced with anti-Semitism and racism, with sexism and homophobia, and also, which is also the background of many more battles. So this inherent link of the university that deserves the name and democracy that deserves the name, I think, turns the university in a place with a political function. And I think without that recognition, there is no way to properly deal with the threats to scholarship, the threats to academic freedom, and what we should do about it. Second, much shorter point. To live up to the task, academic freedom and university autonomy come with an ethics. Specifically, this ethics must inform how a university deals with others, be it international scholars or cooperation, or hosted scholars at risk. Certainly, this ethics is based on an enlightened understanding of freedom and autonomy. Freedom and autonomy are not unlimited use of privilege. There is, however, in the world, a radical misunderstanding or misconception of freedom as such. To many people, professors sometimes, even lawyers, weirdly, liberty or freedom is unrestricted freedom and unlimited liberty. But freedom beyond egocentric autonomy, a liberty that is socially embedded, is the freedom I'm talking about. Thus, this freedom is situated in a world in which we fundamentally accept each other, and that carries obligations. And again, to avoid misunderstandings. When lawyers start talking about obligations, beware. It can get really tricky. Obligations may in fact cover political intrusion or oppression or censorship or other forms of inadequate intervention in research and teaching, and this is not legitimate. So I'm not talking about the imposition of duty to, behave correctly or something. But different from that, the ethics of a university committed to democracy, and that was the point, and to research, sought after in an everlasting conversation in the diversity of equals, is not oppressive or silencing, but it's supportive and empowering. And that's another version of freedom. Such an ethical obligation does not put knowledge or understandings at risk. Such ethics are, however, demanding. And there would be many issues to talk about. The only two things I want to mention are the international dimension. Because I'm standing in a university that hosts scholars at risk. Many of you are hosted in institutions, and many institutions face the question of who to cooperate with in a world that is falling apart at the seams. So, regarding outreach efforts, sending students and scholars abroad, collaborating and cooperating with others in the world, the ethics are all about Alexander. Alexander von Humboldt went to travel, collected things, talked to people, wonderful. Go explore, great idea. But when you look at Alexander's life, you also understand that there is a need for ethics because simple outreach, let's go, doesn't do the thing and can really fail big time. And there are many examples in university polities for this. In efforts to internationalize universities, conflicts arise and have arisen, some quite prominent. So when a university contracts into a partnership with an institution that dismisses scholars based on their political or philosophical views, what do you do about that? Is this freedom? Is this a great internationalization, going out strategy? Or is there a limit to this embedded freedom because it's based on a specific understanding of what this is all about? Conflicts also arise when a university partners with institutions in political contexts in which the core civil and political human rights are not protected. In addition, conflicts arise when cooperation is funded by people or entities that persistently violate fundamental rights. We are all in need of money. Who do you take it from? So would you sign an agreement with an institution where religious freedom and homosexuality are denied or discouraged? Discouraged. And what would you do if a student or scholar faces repression while working and studying there? Where do you draw the red line? I think that's my question. More generally, international cooperation already always poses the question of whether this is still a university endeavor you're going about, and when you should stand up and protest that human rights are infringed, that this is not about education anymore, but some ideological strategy. Note that the bad guys, to use a very overbroad term, note that the bad guys like nothing more than collaborating with the good guys, as it is an excellent way to restore their tarnished reputation and an opportunity to wash their dirty laundry. By way of example, a German partner tends to fully ensure that the other institution out there is wonderful. Because haven't we invented it all? Wilhelm von Humboldt? So sparkling white. Therefore, I think Western universities and Northern universities and scholars are sought after, and they're bribed into cooperation with institutions that use rather than allow for science and academic work. Thus, reaching out to international partners in a governance mode of modest realism requires universities to be diplomatic. And I think there are diplomats in the room who know this is really difficult and not just a remark, but I mean it. This is the outreach side of university ethics. There's another side to it. Regarding the inside, the ethics of a university must make this institution a really good host, truly welcoming the other. When reaching out across borders is in need of diplomacy to avoid the gunboats, inviting in also requires an ethical stance. You may conceptualize this as glocalization, which I think is a good idea, but primarily here comes Caroline. Because Caroline von Humboldt adds diversity to the picture. Diversity? Is this a buzzword? Yes, but could you very quickly simply define the base? I mean, it's a very demanding concept. This is not just, marketing. This is a very demanding concept. Wilhelm designed the institution, Alexander traveled out there, but Caroline invited very different people, not all formally qualified, to her salons to allow for, to empower, and to invest in the fascinating diversity of approaches, understandings, views, and the expertise you haven't even known it existed. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about hosting a scholar. It is way more than a gracious gesture of, you could use my office. The library card, sure, somebody will show you around. It is way more than that. If a university is really about genuine curiosity and appreciation, if a university is really about diversity among equals, then there is a challenging conversation on the way. And if you're hosting someone, this is what this is about. It's not always comfortable. It's not funny all the time. You cannot always feel great. You may even be criticized. All of this. And by the way, I do not consider this a question of priorities or emphasis or choice. I do consider this a question of the very definition of the university, because the university is per se so inextricably linked to democracy. Thus, finally, the way a university treats a scholar at risk is, I think, a litmus test for its very being. A key to an office and a library card will not do, nor will one lunch and a weekend invitation. Rather, universities must and have the opportunity to implement the very French raison d'être, that's what I wanted to say, by truly welcoming scholars at risk. Put differently, glocalization, taking internationalization locally. Glocalization in universities must translate into research and teaching. You can also be nice, that's a wonderful addition. But the prime point is research and teaching. Thus, the more academic institutions live up to the ideal of the Humboldtian University, based on academic freedom, but a nuanced, refined understanding of it, not just some radicalized misunderstanding, you must host scholars from abroad as equals. So if a university is based on that, I think this is the way to go. And this is it, a Berlin call for an university ethics. With Humboldt and human rights, this is a call from Berlin. It's based on the post-1945 never again to persecution, arbitrary denial, anti-Semitism, racism, sexism, homophobia. It's based on all these ideas. That's why I think Berlin is quite an okay, cool, maybe even place for this. But it's also based on these Humboldt people, and you can pick your other, because they were committed to an autonomous community free from state intrusion, yet funded. They were committed to the nomos, the world citizenship, and they were committed to listening beyond prejudice, Caroline. The key proposition is to counter the risk posed by attacks on democracy and on universities and to academic freedom. The call is for a nuanced diplomacy when reaching out. The call is also for truly welcoming and hosting culture at home with more than a benevolent gesture. If these are universities as they are designed to be and strive to stay the space for a cosmopolitan education, Bildung, via exchange among equals, Alexander, Caroline, Wilhelm, it must be an inclusive space. And inclusive means diverse in respect as equals. In the words of the United Nations Committee on Such Human Rights, this allows, and you might not expect this from lawyers, an enlightened and active mind to wander freely and widely as one of the joys and rewards of human existence. This commitment to safeguard democracy and the university is, I think, key to the future of, I guess, all of us, the systems we live in, respect for each other as equals. Thank you for listening.
Wow, this was not only a brilliant, but a very powerful and a very urgent call. And I think there is an urgency right now. There's also an urgency with our time, and we are sort of actually at the end of the session, but I think at least one question, we should allow at least for one question before we go on our tight schedule. But first of all, thank you one more time. It's been a fantastic talk. It's been a fantastic talk, Wow. So, do we have questions from the floor? There's a question over here.
I hadn't prepared a question actually, so, because there hasn't been any time for questions. But thank you so much for this keynote. And I'm a professor in gender studies from Stockholm, Södertörn University. And Judith Butler mentioned, and you mentioned, but very briefly, that one of the hot targets when they are attacking academic freedom is actually gender studies, because we kind of comprise of all these bad things. Could you comment something? Could you say something about it, please?
What worries me is first that this does not happen elsewhere, but it happens all over. That these are very often strategically very well planned, coordinated attacks, that they work smartly. It's hard to use the word smart there, but still, with ressentiment, with all kinds of deeply entrenched, long-lasting mixes of racism, anti-Semitism, sexism, homophobia. So you have intersectionality at its best if you would have read the books before, because then you would have you will have a quick analysis of what's out there. It's complicated, but they employ it very strategically effective in targeting also weak parts in university structures where not so many come to help. So it's an excellent example of what I was talking about regarding democracy, because you see too many people saying, you know, they have been exaggerating a little, didn't they? And, you know, aren't they always like lesbians or something? I mean, there was, yeah, you know, I mean, you know, you don't say this publicly anymore, but you keep hearing it again, it's coming back. So this mix of deeply entrenched stereotype and prejudice, never fully established recognition in the academy, deeply challenging research, they hate the results, the questions even, and the lack of protection and solidarity in the academy make it a prime example of what I think is happening also on a broader scale regarding the rule of law. In particular, as a member of a court, I do deeply care about this, and I think it would be naive to think that even Karlsruhe, you know, they cannot be touched. They can be touched, and quickly, in all countries around us. But gender studies is a prime example in the academy why it's not only about a specific place, it's about a general strategy. It's also not only about getting rid of these women and these radicals there, but it's working with the solidarities, the ressentiment-driven solidarities in the academy. It caters to privilege, it bribes people into denouncing again, and it's so cheap. Yeah, it's so outrageously cheap. I'm sorry I didn't hear Judith Butler's keynote. I think she would be able to say much more about this, but that would be my take on this. So I could call it a litmus test regarding the treatment of fields and faculties and departments. The way you treat gender studies in a university will tell you a lot about the understanding of a university as a truly critical space of research in diversity among equals. If they don't get that, then there's a serious entrenched structural problem, and not just some disenchantment with some results. Not everything is wonderful in gender studies, sure, but when was everything wonderful in medicine, physics, or philosophy? So, yeah, so I think a litmus test case.
Okay, with looking at my watch, I think we actually do have to stop here now. All I want to say is I hope we're going to get this in written form as well. A Berlin call for a new university ethics, or for a university ethics. I think that would be something we all can use in our institutions. Thank you again, Susanne Baer.